When the cold fluorescent lights flicker on in the execution chamber, the countdown begins. Just 15 minutes remain for a life to end, and for the state of Indiana to add another name to its judicial history. Since 1977, only 20 death row inmates have been executed in this state. The number is small, but each case has left a deep scar on the community's memory. One man murdered his ex-wife's entire family, then savored a prime rib dinner like it was a celebration. Another killed 2 children, but before dying, simply asked for a pint of ice cream. And there was one who, in his final moments, smiled defiantly and uttered words that sent chills through the room. Let us now step into 10 of the most infamous execution chambers in Indiana. Places where justice or the ultimate punishment was carried out in silence, and where memories never fade. Before we begin, leave a comment below. Which country or state are you watching from? Let's see how far these stories have traveled. Now, we begin with the first case. First, Stephen Timothy Judy. It was an April morning in 1979. A hint of spring chill still lingered in the air over Indianapolis, Indiana. Terry Chasteen, 21 years old, a single mother, was driving her Plymouth Duster, taking her 3 young children to daycare before heading to work. Misty Ann, 5 years old, sat in the front seat, twirling her golden curls. Stephen, 4, was singing in the back, the youngest. Mark, just over 2 years old, clutched his teddy bear tightly. What seemed like a normal morning suddenly turned when the car's fan belt slipped. The engine stalled in the middle of a busy highway. No cell phone. No family nearby. Terry pulled her children out of the car, hoping someone passing by might help. Then, a light blue pickup truck pulled over. A young man stepped out, tall, with wind-tossed hair. He smiled, introduced himself as Steve, and said he had experience fixing cars. His voice was soft, almost gentle. He asked, "Do you want me to give you and the kids a ride to the nearest service station?" Terry hesitated, but with no other option. She nodded. That was the moment everything fell apart. Stephen Timothy Judy, 23 years old, was no good Samaritan. He had a history of rape, had once escaped a juvenile detention center, and for years had harbored dark fantasies about hurting women. He didn't take them to a repair shop. Instead, he turned onto a narrow dirt road that led to a remote area near White Lick Creek, a place where no one would hear them scream. There, he led the mother and her children into the woods and committed a horrifying crime that left all 4 dead. The details still haunt Indiana to this day. There were no screams, no chance to run. He left their bodies scattered among the grass, stones, and cold water when the police found the children. The scene was unforgettable, a tragedy beyond imagination. Judy was arrested soon after. But what chilled Indiana wasn't just the crime, it was how he faced justice. He didn't cry. He didn't make excuses. He rejected legal counsel, refused to appeal, and in court said coldly, "If I get out, I'll kill again." This wasn't just a trial. It was society staring into the eyes of someone who had lost all humanity. On March 9, 1981, Stephen Judy became the first person executed in Indiana since 1961. He sat in the old electric chair at the state prison in Michigan City. His last meal was like a grotesque farewell banquet: prime rib, lobster, a baked potato with sour cream, salad with French dressing, and dinner rolls. He asked for 4 cans of beer but was denied. Before the switch was flipped, Judy gave his final words. "I hold no grudges. This is something I did. I'm sorry it happened. No swearing, no blame, no plea for mercy, just a brief apology meant for someone. Though no one knows who, but one thing is certain, his crime, like the waters that took those 3 children, remains etched into the death penalty history of Indiana." Second, Joseph Edward Corcoran, Fort Wayne, Indiana, July 1997. A small house sat quietly in a peaceful neighborhood, where summer nights were usually filled with the sound of crickets and the steady hum of electric fans. But that night, 4 men would never walk out of that house again. Joseph Edward Corcoran, 22 years old, walked in holding a handgun. In less than 5 minutes, 4 men lay dead: James, his own brother; Robert Turner, his sister's fiancé; and 2 close friends, Timothy Bricker and Douglas Stillwell. They had once been family, friends, the closest people in Corcoran's life, and now they were just names on a coroner's report. There was no warning, no struggle, just an eruption, cold, brutal, and final. Corcoran opened fire, killing 4 loved ones in an instant, then walked away as if checking off a task on his daily list. The motive: no one knows for sure. Some said he was jealous. Others believed he feared betrayal. But in his medical records, doctors made one thing clear: Joseph Corcoran suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. He believed his family was spying on him with ultrasonic waves, that someone was programming him to fail. When arrested, Corcoran did not resist. He was sentenced to death in 1999. But it would take nearly 25 years for Indiana to carry out that sentence, delayed by numerous appeals focused on his mental health. During that time, Corcoran lived quietly in solitary confinement, writing journals, even penning a book about being remotely controlled. On December 18th, 2024, Joseph Corcoran entered the execution chamber. He was the first person executed in Indiana after a 15-year pause. No family, no pastor, no weeping. Only medical staff and journalist witnesses to justice, or at least trying to understand it. His last meal was strikingly simple: a single pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. No meat, no dessert tray, just ice cream, cold and sweet. When asked for any final words, Corcoran simply shook his head and said, "Not really. Let's get this over with." No remorse, no denial, just a chilling surrender, like the death he once dealt to 4 of his own. Joseph Edward Corcoran, the second name on this list, leaves us with a quiet question: when someone with a broken mind commits a crime, where do we draw the line between punishment and healing? And is justice truly just for those lost long ago to madness? Third, Matthew Eric Wrinkles, Evansville, Indiana, July 1994. A quiet suburban home turned into the scene of a family massacre that shook the entire state. Matthew Eric Wrinkles, 31 years old, had once been a father, an electrician, and a man trying to survive a bitter divorce. His wife, Deborah Jean Wrinkles, had left him, taking their 2 children and staying with her brother Tony Fulkerson and sister-in-law, Natalie. A restraining order had been issued against him, but it was suddenly lifted just one day before everything fell apart. On the night of July 21st, Wrinkles, dressed in camouflage, wore a ski mask, and carried a .357 Magnum revolver along with a rifle under cover of darkness. He cut the phone line and silently broke into the house. Gunshots rang out. 3 lives were taken in minutes: Deborah, the woman he once vowed to protect; Tony, the brother-in-law; and Natalie, an innocent woman who simply opened the door. Their children were in the next room. They survived, but lost both parents in a single night. Wrinkles was arrested soon after. In his confession, he blamed emotion, drugs, and desperation, but no explanation could fully justify the cold resolve of a man who entered a home intending to end 3 lives. In 1995, he was sentenced to death. During the years that followed, Matthew became one of the few death row inmates featured in the documentary series Inside Indiana State Prison, where he spoke of regret, yet still harbored bitterness and blame. On December 11th, 2009, Matthew Eric Wrinkles entered the lethal injection chamber. His last meal had been served 3 days earlier in traditional Indiana fashion: prime rib, fried pork chops, baked potato, French fries, 2 ranch-dressed salads, and dinner rolls. When asked if he had any final words, Wrinkles replied, "Nothing at this time. Let's do it. Lock and load." That's a borrowed line, but whatever. A sentence that felt like both defiance and surrender. Matthew Eric Wrinkles, the man who killed 3 family members in one night. A father who lost everything, became the last person executed in Indiana before the state paused capital punishment. And his story, like an interrupted song, still echoes in the minds of the children left behind. Fourth, Alan Lehman Matheney, Mishawaka, Indiana. A cool afternoon in early March 1989. Lisa Bianco, 29 years old, had just returned home from a walk with her 2 young daughters. Their small house sat in a quiet neighborhood, where the only sounds most afternoons were the patter of children's footsteps. But just minutes later, the air was filled with screams, and an ending no one could reverse. Alan Lehman, Matheney Lisa's ex-husband, had been serving time for assaulting and confining her. He had been granted an 8-hour release from prison for a home visit. But instead of returning to Indianapolis as planned, he drove straight to South Bend. He stopped by a friend's house to pick up a shotgun, then headed for Lisa's home. When Lisa saw him crossing the yard, weapon in hand, eyes red with rage, she knew she had to run. She bolted out the door, shouting for help. Neighbors peeked through windows. Her daughters watched, frozen in terror, but no one reached her in time. Right there in the street, in full view of her children, Lisa was beaten to death by Alan. This wasn't just a murder. It was a betrayal of a system that had promised to protect her. Alan was arrested shortly afterward, in the early days of his detention. He claimed hallucinations said Lisa was part of a conspiracy against him. He insisted he remembered nothing, but forensic experts concluded he was fully aware of his actions. In 1990, the court sentenced him to death. The case sparked a wave of reform in Indiana's prison system, including new laws requiring that victims be notified any time an inmate is released, even temporarily. On September 28, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison, Alan Lehman Matheney entered the execution chamber. His final meal was simple, almost like a quiet family dinner: fried chicken wings, French fries, boiled corn, biscuits, and a chocolate milkshake. Before the injection, Alan gave his final words: "I love my family and my children. I am sorry for the pain I have caused them. I thank the friends who stood by me. I am certain my grandchildren will grow up strong and happy in the care of their wonderful parents." But no apology, however heartfelt or late, could erase the pain that Lisa Bianco and her children endured. Alan Matheney, once a father, once a husband, became a symbol of how the system failed to protect a victim of domestic violence, and his sentence became an unspoken warning that sometimes institutional neglect can be a death sentence of its own. 5th, Donald Ray Wallace, Jr. Evansville, Indiana, January 1980. The city lay under the chill of early winter, when a brutal family massacre, the worst in local history, shattered the calm of a quiet neighborhood. Donald Ray Wallace, Jr., 23 years old, started that night with the intent to steal. He broke into Ralph Hendrick's home, but, as he later admitted, got greedy and targeted the house next door where the Gilligan family lived. He didn't expect them to be home. Patrick Gilligan, his wife Teresa, and their 2 young children, Lisa, 5 years old, and Gregory, 4, were in the middle of dinner. Wallace entered with a gun, took control, and, in a calculated act of cruelty, murdered all 4. Later, Wallace confessed to friends he shot Patrick for causing trouble, shot Teresa because she screamed and he needed her to be quiet. "As for the children," he said, "I couldn't let them grow up with the pain of losing their parents." He left the house with a gun, a CB radio, a scanner, and other items, all of which were later traced back to him. The community was horrified. Police tracked him down within days. Wallace was arrested but denied the killings. For the next 2 years, he claimed insanity and was held in a psychiatric hospital. His IQ was measured at 130, but just weeks before his execution, Wallace admitted he had faked it. The case of Donald Wallace did more than shock the public. It came to represent absolute cold-bloodedness, a sharp mind, fully aware, completely calculated, and without a trace of remorse. On March 10, 2005, Wallace entered the lethal injection chamber at the Indiana State Prison. His final meal, a sirloin steak, baked potato, soup, and chocolate truffle cake from a local Damon's Grill, was served as a quiet ritual before the end. When asked for final words, Wallace said, "I hope everyone can find peace after this. No grand statements, no resistance, but also no real remorse." Donald Ray Wallace, Jr., a thief who stepped into the wrong house and became a killer. He wasn't overtaken by rage or delusion. He simply chose and delivered death. His story is a grim reminder that some crimes can't be explained by anger or illness, only by cruelty. 6th, Bill J. Benefiel, Terre Haute, Indiana, October 1986, in a quiet neighborhood where lawns were neatly trimmed and cars lined up in driveways. No one knew that, just a few houses away, a living nightmare was unfolding behind aging walls. Bill J. Benefiel, 27 years old at the time, was a reclusive man, barely noticed. But inside an abandoned house he had renovated. He built his own world, a world of control, violence, and unspeakable cruelty. A 17-year-old girl named Alicia Elmore was held captive in that house for 4 months. What she endured during that time, though impossible to fully recount, was enough to horrify an entire community once the truth came out. He controlled every minute, limited her food and movement, and blindfolded her to keep her from identifying him. In January 1987, Alicia discovered she wasn't the only one. 18-year-old Dolores Wells was also being held. Soon after, Dolores disappeared. Her body was later found buried nearby. That was when Alicia saw her chance and escaped. Police raided the house and arrested Bill Benefiel. He did not resist. In court, he tried to claim insanity, but doctors determined he was fully competent. His actions were not the result of illness, they were deliberate choices. In 1988, he was sentenced to death on April 21, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison. Benefiel faced his final sentence. His last meal was bizarre, almost like a twisted celebration, a large pizza topped with sausage, pepperoni, mushrooms, onions, green peppers, black olives, and tomatoes, a 12-inch Italian beef sub with cheese, 4 quarts of Ben & Jerry's ice cream, butter pecan, cherry Garcia, New York super fudge chunk, and oatmeal cookie chunk, a Dutch apple pie, 6 cans of RC Cola, and 6 cans of Pepsi. Before the injection, Benefiel looked directly at the executioner and said, "No. Just get it over with. Let's do it. No apology, no remorse." Bill Benefiel, the man who created a real-life hell inside a suburban home, left this world in silence. But his story lives on. A deep crack in the heart of Terre Haute, and a chilling reminder that behind any door, darkness might be waiting. 7th, Gregory Scott Johnson. Anderson, Indiana, June 1985. The sun had not yet fully risen when thick black smoke began pouring from the roof of a small, peaceful home. By the time firefighters arrived, there was only one thing left to pull from the ashes: the body of 82-year-old Ruby Hutzlar. She had lived alone, known by neighbors as kind and quiet. But her death wasn't an accident. All around the house were signs of a break-in. Cabinets flung open, belongings scattered. Footprints marked the floor, and walls the first clues that led police to Gregory Scott Johnson, 20 years old. At first, he denied everything. But the evidence was overwhelming: the footprints, witness accounts, physical traces. Gregory confessed he had broken in to steal, but when Ruby confronted him, he panicked, killed her, then set the house on fire to cover it all up. The community was stunned. A defenseless elderly woman, murdered in her own home. In 1986, the court sentenced him to death, but Johnson would spend nearly 2 more decades behind bars, filing appeal after appeal, not out of innocence, but to delay the inevitable. In 2005, Johnson requested a stay of execution for humanitarian reasons. He wanted to donate part of his liver to his ailing sister. The request divided public opinion. Some sympathized. Others believed forgiveness should not come so easily. The request was denied. On May 25, 2005, Gregory Scott Johnson entered the execution chamber at the Indiana State Prison. His final meal: barbecued ribs, pulled pork, sautéed mushrooms, soda, and chocolate cheesecake, though his specific request for an Oreo version was unavailable for his attorneys. He ordered pizzas, perhaps a late thank you, or a hollow gesture in the face of the end. Johnson's final words were brief and quiet. "You've been very professional. No excuses, no pleas. Just a closing line like the last door shutting behind a man who once had a choice, and chose the wrong one." Gregory Johnson, a name now tied to a fire that destroyed more than a house. It burned through trust, through peace, through an entire neighborhood's sense of safety. A quiet end to a path of irreversible wrongdoing. 8. Kevin Aaron Connor. Indianapolis, Indiana, January 1988. The chill of the new year left the streets quieter than usual, but in a small home on the city's west side. Laughter and the smell of alcohol still drifted through the windows. 4 men had gathered: Kevin Connor, Tony Moore, Steve Wentland, and Bruce Voge. That night, none of them knew only one would still be alive by dawn. After hours of drinking, Moore, Connor, and Wentland left the house in a car. The mood was sluggish until an argument broke out between Moore and Wentland. In the vehicle, Moore assaulted Wentland. When the victim tried to flee, Moore chased him down with the car, running him over. Connor, instead of stopping the violence, joined in. Wentland died in the dark. But that was only the beginning. Soon after, Connor and Moore returned to their workplace. A new argument sparked, this time about the murder. Connor pulled out a gun and shot Moore on the spot. Then, he returned to the original house, where Bruce Voge, the 4th man, was still asleep on the couch. Connor raised the gun again, taking a 3rd life in one night. He was arrested in Texas days later. Connor didn't deny the killings. He accepted the death sentence without resistance. Years later, he voluntarily waived all appeals, as if he himself knew the line had been crossed beyond return. On July 27, 2005, Kevin Connor spent his final hours in the death row wing at the Indiana State Prison. That evening, he was granted a rare exception permission to smoke 2 cigars, a privilege rarely extended to inmates awaiting execution. His last meal included 4 chili dogs, onion rings, a banana cream pie, and an Oreo cookie blizzard ice cream. When asked if he had any final words, Kevin Connor offered a faint smile and said, "Everyone's got to die sometime, so keep on killing. No remorse, no request for mercy. Just a cold, haunting sentence left hanging in the room." Kevin Connor, who took 3 lives in just a few hours, stood as a grim example of how anger and alcohol can open the door to destruction. And sometimes, the silence of a conscience is more chilling than any sentence a court could deliver. 9th, Joseph L. Trueblood. Lafayette, Indiana, August 1988. Early in the morning, Joseph Trueblood, 31 years old, drove to pick up his former girlfriend, Susan Boucher, 22, along with her 2 young children, Ashlyn, 2.5, and William, just 17 months old. No one knew this would be the last ride they would ever take. Joseph and Susan had a long history of breakups. She had recently chosen to leave him for her former husband, a decision Joseph refused to accept. Friends sensed tension, but no one could have imagined the heartbreak that would follow. According to court records, Joseph killed all 3 at close range. The murders stunned the state. Later, he drove to his brother's home, borrowed a shovel, dug a shallow grave near the outskirts of West Point, and buried their bodies. Trueblood was arrested shortly after. At his first trial, he admitted to killing Susan, hoping it might spare him the death penalty. But later, he changed his story, claiming Susan had killed the children and then herself, and that he only helped with the final shot. His shifting narrative, combined with his brother's testimony and forensic evidence, proved otherwise. The court was not convinced. Joseph was sentenced to death for all 3 murders. His appeals stretched over a decade and failed. On the night of June 13, 2003, at the Indiana State Prison, Joseph Trueblood entered his final hours. He refused a special last meal as a protest against what he called a ritual of state-sponsored killing. Instead, he was served the standard prison fare: a bologna sandwich, a cheese sandwich, fruit, and cookies. He did not eat. His final statement, read aloud by attorney John Summers, declared, "I am innocent. Bosher committed suicide. I only pled guilty because my lawyer told me it was the only way to avoid the death penalty. That is the only reason I admitted guilt. If I took a polygraph, it would prove I'm telling the truth." Joseph L. Trueblood, once a trusted companion to a young mother and her children, left the world in controversy, denial, and silence. But the question lingers still: was he a victim, or the true perpetrator? And if justice remains unsure, can truth ever fully come to light? 10. Kevin Lee Hough, Fort Wayne, Indiana, November 1985. In a small house on West Wayne Street, two longtime friends, Theodore Bosler, 49, and Martin Rubrake, 56, lived quiet, simple lives. They shared rent, shared meals, and shared the everyday rhythm of aging together. But one fateful evening, that house became the site of a crime that shook the entire community. Kevin Lee Hough, 26 years old, had once been an acquaintance. He and his younger brother, Dwayne Lapp, showed up at the door claiming they needed to settle a financial issue. Rubrake let them in without hesitation. Just minutes later, Hough led both men into the basement. In the dim light, he pulled a gun. When Rubrake resisted with a remote control, Hough shot him in the chest. Bosler, who had been lying on the floor as ordered, was also shot without mercy. Then, Hough returned and fired again just to make sure he was dead. Before leaving, he searched the bodies and stole their rings, and in a final act of cruelty, he stomped on Rubrake's face. Just 11 days earlier, Hough had committed another murder: Antoni Bartkowiak, a Polish immigrant. Hough and his accomplice interrogated him about drugs, then executed him when they found nothing. 3 lives, 11 days, a cold, calculated trail of violence. Hough was arrested and sentenced to death in 1987. Over the next 17 years, he filed numerous appeals but never fully denied what he had done. Some things the law cannot erase. On May 2nd, 2003, at the Indiana State Prison, Kevin Hough entered the execution chamber. He declined a special last meal, not as a gesture of remorse, but perhaps simply to end it all in silence. Just before the injection, Hough gave his final words: "I hope the victims' families find some measure of satisfaction. I hope their sorrow is not too great." A gentle statement, but not enough to soothe what had been taken. Kevin Lee Hough, who killed 3 people for greed and disregard, left this world quietly. But what he left behind still echoes in the memory of a community that once believed evil couldn't come knocking in the middle of everyday life. 10 executions, 10 stories that scarred the memory of Indiana. Each death row inmate on this list is more than just a name. They are a bitter reminder that when reason and humanity are lost, the consequences are irreversible. Justice may close a chapter, but the memory of the victims that never fades. What are your thoughts on the death penalty? On the line between punishment and forgiveness? Leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and what you believe. If you think these stories deserve to be heard, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next.